G'day guys, Clayton from Workbench Hobbies with my first venture into the YouTube world. Last year I was lucky enough to get up to Oz Armour Fest at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum up in Cairns, and I met up with the boys from the best tank podcast going around, Totally Tanked. They thought it would be a great idea to put together a group build for beginner modelers and just modelers in general as a way to connect community and introduce the hobby to some people that haven't been introduced to it before. The kit that was chosen is the Panzer 38T from Tamiya in 35th scale. It doesn't get much kinder than this kit, so it should suit the beginner. I will be building my own model in a separate video. However, I thought it'd be a good idea for the beginner modeler to get some hints and tips to make the build process a little more palatable for them. Hope the video helps you out, and if you've got any questions, please put them below or reach out through Facebook. Enjoy.
One of the most important things to do when you open your model is have a look at your instructions, familiarise yourself with the steps, work through in a methodical way and get a feel for what the model is going to look like. It's really important at the start to understand how the instructions work. The instructions work in step-by-step process, calling out firstly the sprue letter and then the part number. This kit comes with two options for the subject that you're going to build, option A and option B. The only difference is option A has a bow-mounted machine gun and option B does not. That would reflect the actual historical tank that the kit is trying to replicate. You'll see at step 9 there is an option to choose either A or B, and it's really important to know what your end goal is before you start building. Now it's time to open the bags and carefully make sure none of the parts have fallen off in the bag. You'll see on the sprues the letter number in a corner, and each part then has a corresponding number that will relate back to the instructions. It's always a good idea to familiarise yourself with all the parts on the sprues and get a feel for the model. Checking out all the bits and pieces in the box is one of my favourite things to do when I get a new kit. This kit comes with a small piece of photo etch that will give us a little lift in the detail. And also in this bag is the water slide decals that give us the option to build one of two subjects. One of the most important tools in a modeler's toolbox is the sprue cutters. They help remove the parts from the sprues and remove them in a clean, efficient way. The better the cut we can make here, the less cleanup we have to do later. It's important to use the back part of the blade hard up against the part on the sprue to get a good clean cut. So once the parts have been removed from the sprue, you'll see that it is inevitable there'll be a little bit of leftover that will need to be cleaned up. This is done by just using a hobby blade, by first removing the raised section as best you can without gouging the part, and then I just run the edge of the blade over the part to shave it down and smooth it off. Cleaning the parts can also be done using a sanding stick or a combination of both. It's just a matter of the tools you have and the techniques you like to use. Different grit sandpapers will give you a different finish, so be sure to use the appropriate one. I think around about 800 grit would probably be my utility one that I would use most of the time to give you a decent finish. Now to the glue. We won't be getting much modelling done without it. I recommend the Tamiya Extra Thin, or if you can't get that, the Revell Contactor. The issue with the contactor is that sometimes the needle comes out and needs to be cleaned up and reinserted into the bottle. It can dry out as well, so I would recommend the Tamiya Extra Thin if you can find it. I'm actually using the quick setting style. There is a standard available as well. Either is fine. And now it's time to dry fit the parts. So with all the cleanup done, the model is starting to take shape. I like to dry fit the parts to ensure everything is going to go together snugly. And once I'm satisfied, load the applicator brush up with glue and let the capillary action of the fluid of the glue run through the joint, and you can give it a little bit of a helping hand by running the brush along the seam. As a general rule, the less glue, the better. However, you have to make sure you're obviously using enough to hold the parts together. It's also worth noting that in the dry fitting stage, if something doesn't fit together properly or doesn't seem right, chances are you've got something wrong. Go back, check your instructions, check that you've cleaned the part up properly, and retry. You'll notice here that I apply the glue sparingly to the seam, and be careful not to touch the part once it's got glue on it, because what the glue does is soften the plastic and causes a chemical reaction to join the two parts. And should you get your finger on it, you're going to make a mess of your model. So just beware of that. Again, we dry fit a part. Everything looks like it's going to fit. And then gently load the brush with the glue and let it run through the joint. You can help the contact points by gently pushing the parts together, and as you can see, the joint will hold together pretty quickly, especially with the quick setting type of Tamiya Extra Thin. I mentioned before that when we dry fit, that if something doesn't look quite right, it's usually because something isn't right, and this is a perfect example of that happening to me, where I haven't cleaned the part up properly when it was removed from the sprue. So it didn't look right. Work out what the issue is, clean it up, and you'll see if we refit the part, it should now fit nice and snug. No big gaps. Everything looks as it should. The kit comes with a small photo etch fret. Now the photo etch is a metal part, and it's designed to add that little bit of extra detail to the kit, and it will sit over the radiator intake. And look away right now, because that is probably the worst thing you can do for your sprue cutters. Please don't use your sprue cutters to cut photo etch. It's a really bad idea. Best way to cut it would be with a nice sharp hobby blade against something hard like a tile or a dinner plate or something like that. Inevitably the parts will need a little bit of sanding just to tidy up any of the burrs left from the removal. When attaching the photo etch part to the model, you are going to require super glue. Because the photo etch part is made of metal, it will not chemically react with the plastic like the joining of the parts with the Tamiya Extra Thin, so we need to use super glue in order to hold the part on. I'm using a Flexi Black super glue from VMS, however, just about any super glue will do. The trick with the super glue is be very refined with how you are using it, because it will get on your fingers and it will cause you headaches if you're not careful. So I'm using the tip of a toothpick to carefully apply a perimeter of the glue and I will place the part on carefully. Time to start working on the wheels, and the wheels are removed from the sprues. There is a seam that runs around the outside edge of the rubber section of the wheel that needs to be tidied up, just using the back edge of the hobby knife. An interesting way to add a little bit of character to your model is to take a few little chips out of the edges of the wheel. This would have occurred with road wear on the actual rubber sections of the wheels in real life. So just scuffing it up and taking a few little nicks out is a really quick and easy way to replicate the damage to the wheel. A light sand will make sure we haven't missed removing any of the seam lines and smooth the part out, ready for paint. The kit comes with a small bag of polycaps. Now, polycaps are a small silicon part that will sit inside usually the road wheels and sometimes the gun assembly, and they will allow some movement in the part. These polycaps are going to sit within the drive socket, so you can see it's inserted into the middle. The two halves of the wheel are joined, encasing the polycap. I like to pre-paint my wheels and running gear, and a quick and easy way to do this is attach your wheels to a toothpick using a small piece of blue tack. By attaching the wheels to the toothpicks, they become very easy to handle, and I usually use a small cardboard box or piece of foam just to keep them all in the one place and get them ready for painting. With the wheels prepared, it's time to start painting. I have chosen Tamiya paint here because it's reasonably forgiving for the beginner. We can thin it down with water, and I don't usually brush paint because I have an airbrush, but just as a little bit of an idea, I've done about 20 drops of paint here, and I will thin it down with probably about 5 or 6 drops of water. However, this is something you're going to have a little bit of a play with yourself. If the water's too runny, it won't go down properly. If it's too thick, it'll look a little bit gluggy. But like I said, Tamiya paint is reasonably forgiving, so I'm kind of learning on the fly here myself too. Having the wheels on the toothpicks means we can easily handle the wheel for painting. I've loaded the brush and just taken off the excess, and then just carefully painting it to the part. I'm also painting the underside of the model while I have access to it, because once the wheels and tracks go on, it's going to be a little bit tricky to paint. So I will brush paint this whilst I've got paint on the brush. Like I said though, most of my painting I would do with an airbrush, but for the beginner, this is a great place to start. For the rubber sections on the wheels, a thin mix of black from Tamiya, a little bit of water, keeping the brush wet, and carefully moving around the edge of the part, slowly twisting the toothpick that the wheel is mounted on, and painting the rubber sections is quite an easy thing to do using this method. A good quality brush will help you hold that line as well. So remember to take your time, and you can always go back and touch up if you have a little faux pas. Now onto the tracks. Now, pre-painting parts on sprues is a little bit of a no-no for various reasons. However, I won't go into them now, but I'm going to break my rule and I'm going to pre-paint these Lincoln length tracks. It's just going to speed up the process and mean that I have good access to the parts whilst they're still on the sprues. You can see that the top length of the track has got the sag already built in, which should look pretty amazing once it's connected to the kit. A mix of black and red brown is put together with a little bit of water, a little bit more black. This is just going to be a base color for our track, and it should be a rusty, dark, irony sort of a color. I have no ratio for this. It's all mixed by eye, and it's really just to differentiate the track part. Using a flat brush, the paint mix is painted all over the parts. Doesn't have to be too precise. It's really just about getting some coverage before we start applying it to the model. As mentioned before, I would usually use an airbrush for this. However, I'm trying to gear this video up to the beginner who may not have an airbrush, or at least not accessed the one yet, just to show you that hand painting is possible and you can get a reasonable result. With the paint dry, the wheels are all fitted off to the model now. Everything should look in alignment when you check it, and if you put it flat and apply a little bit of pressure, there shouldn't be any wobble or rock in the model. And now it's time to add the tracks. So once the paint is dried, I'm removing the track parts from the sprues. Once all the track parts are removed from the sprues, I like to lay them out in front of me, matching the instructions to make sure I have the right number of pieces in the right places before I start applying glue. Now, a lot of people fall over at this step and have a lot of trouble with link and length tracks. However, it's actually quite simple. Best way to assemble these link and length tracks is lay them out flat on your work table. A pair of tweezers comes in really handy because these tracks are tiny, and you will find that there is a male and a female side. So gently seat them together, and with a touch of glue from the brush, well, now I'm going to do another part. So the longer the assembly you can make here, the better. However, there you go, just a tiny little touch will be enough to hold the pieces together. Using capillary action with the glue, it will flow through the part, and I'm just helping them hold together, and then assembly continues. Again, we'll add another couple of links. Continue this construction method until everything but the top length of track is glued together. You have a working window with the track, so what you can now do is lay it down flat, seat the model on where it needs to be, and because the glue is still a little bit soft, you can feed the track around the drive socket and the idler wheel. And because we have a poly cap in that drive socket, there is a little bit of movement. You need to make sure the track sits over the teeth properly, and the wheels are sitting between the horns in the tracks, like that, and then feed the rear of the track around the idler wheel. And here I'm just test fitting the top track to make sure everything looks like it's going to fit, which it does. The sag is in the appropriate places. A touch of glue will set everything in place. Little touch of glue on the return rollers just to hold that track down in place. And then the last piece of the puzzle at the rear, just using the tweezers to help the parts find where they need to be. And then a touch of glue will hold them in place. Real simple, real quick, real easy. And then if you look at the model, the track sag should be in the appropriate places. There shouldn't be any gaps, and the model should sit nice and flat on your work surface. With the wheels and tracks attached, it's now time to fit the guardrails for the tracks. It takes a little bit of angling to get them to sit in. However, you shouldn't have too many troubles there. I'm going to do something a little bit different with my model. However, just a touch of glue in through there and your track guards should be attached. Now, when building this model, I really recommend getting yourself a pair of decent tweezers. A decent pair of tweezers will make your modeling far more pleasurable. I didn't actually realize this Tamiya kit had so many small fine parts, and I, like I said, recommend a decent pair of tweezers to improve your modeling. Decals or water slide transfers can make such a big difference to a model, and there's just a few little tricks to applying them. Cut as close as you can without cutting into the decal itself with a pair of scissors or a nice sharp hobby blade on a flat surface. The decals will come with a carrier film, so the closer you can cut to the actual marking, the more chance you've got of removing some of that and having it be less obvious once it's on the model. Now, the transfer is put in a bowl of water. Warm water will speed the process up. However, I'm just using cold water. And decals will be different depending on the manufacturer and the time of manufacture. However, they usually take about a minute to release from the backing film. You'll note that I have got decal softener there in the background. I'm not going to use it at the moment. I've just wet the surface of the model that I'm going to apply this decal on, and you'll see it just slides straight off the carrier film onto the model. And if it falls back on itself, don't panic, just keep it wet, and you'll find that I'm just going to wick away a little bit of the moisture there, just so we can move the deck around a bit. You have to be very careful using sharp objects with them because they can rip. And I'm just using a cotton bud here to remove some of the excess water. Just gently rolling from the center out to try and remove any air that might be trapped or any water that might be trapped. It's also worth mentioning the integrity of your paint. A good, clean paint job should give you a decent or at least a better result with your decals than something that, is a matte finish, rough. This is something that you're just going to learn with time. I've applied a little bit of the decal softener on here, even though these decals didn't really need it. They were very thin, but what it does, it's a chemical reaction that softens the decal and it'll make it sit down into those textures and contours of the model a little better. Now I'm just removing some of that with some water now, just so it doesn't taint the paint. Obviously this isn't our Panzer 38, this is just a sacrificial model because I've got different plans for mine, but I just wanted to show you how the decals worked. If you were having particular problems with the decal sitting down into a rough textured surface, you can also apply the decal softener at the first stage and then slide your decal on and then softener on top again. One last hint and tip for this little Panzer 38 build is the brush painting. Fine brush painting detail around the model can really lift the model, really add some visual interest. I'm using acrylic paints here because I have them and they can tend to be a little bit easier to work with a brush. However, Tamiya paints thinned down with water will be fine, will do the same job. The quality of your brush makes a real difference, which is why I recommended in the build list to buy a good selection of brushes, various sizes, various shapes, Now you'll see I'm just keeping the paintbrush wet and I'm starting to paint the details around the model. Here we're painting the machine gun. I'm just using a black grey colour for this. And the jack. Just to add a little bit of colour variation, I'm going to use a field grey for one of the jerry cans. And the muffler section on my model is going to get a little bit of a special treatment, but for the sake of the video, I'm just going to paint it using various tones of greys. There's a few little tricks we can use to make it look like a rusty exhaust. However, this is the foundation layer. You can see the paint is reasonably wet and I'm using a dabbing motion in an irregular fashion to put the paint down. All will make sense, just tune in for my next video. So when painting the parts around your model, think about what they were made of. Different tones, different colours, variations will just add so much to your model. At the moment I'm painting the timber jack block in a cork brown. This will be weathered down later. However, we start from a mid-tone wooden colour for this part. The spare tracks at the front of the tank are painted in a German camo black-brown colour. Again, it's just going to add a splash of variation, something a little different, but it's designed to represent rusty, irony, worn, weathered tracks. The high points of the tracks are now painted in a matte aluminium to represent the polished parts of the operational tracks. A lot of this will be toned down significantly once we start weathering the model, but this is a good foundation to start from.
So congratulations, you've made it all the way to the end. At the time that this video was uploaded, I'm still working on mine for the next video, but here's a little sneak peek into where I'm up to with mine. It obviously looks a little different to some of the ideas that I've been putting forward because I've been putting my own spin on it and doing some advanced techniques. But this is what you can expect your model to start to look like with a little bit of patience, a little bit of time, a little bit of practice. Remember to subscribe, give us a like if you liked it, leave your comments below. Be sure to connect with us on Facebook, Workbench Hobbies, and thanks for watching, really appreciate it.